Good morning, everybody. Welcome to another edition of Hawk Blogger Mornings. I am Brian Nemhauser. You can find me on Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, everywhere at Hawk Blogger. And it is a Seahawks Saturday, which means only one thing. We get to hang out with my good pal, Jeff Simmons, with like that beautiful picture in your backdrop. How are you doing today, Jeff?
I'm doing okay. I'm not in my house today. I'm somewhere else. So you can tell by the background. That's not usually a photo you'd see behind me, but I'm good, man. I got hit with a scary realization yesterday. There's still 4 weeks until the draft.
Yeah,
It's like, oh my
yeah.
god, how is there still another month of this? But I was like, oh my god, I don't know what are we gonna do for this, but there's a lot of other sports going on, but man, it hit me like right in the eyes yesterday.
Yeah, yeah, it is. It's kind of the dog days for sure. And I kind of wondered what's been getting your attention, if not the. I mean, the draft obviously is still a ways away. You know, the Blue Jays stink. The Mariners not so great either. You know, what's gathering your attention right now?
Well, I've been watching a lot of March Madness. It's been a weird tournament, and I used to be like obsessed with March Madness. Like it was these 4 days or whatever last week were like my favorite days of the year. This year's been like pretty vanilla. Like it's all favorites winning. Like I run a pretty big March Madness pool, like 400 or 500 people, so that keeps me occupied. But other than that, with football, I've been spending a lot of time. Obviously, you did a great show on the Ben Solak article. That one was very. That one definitely got me. There's been all like the rankings that have come out. Like I know PFF did a thing, the Athletic, and I've just been a little perplexed about some of these rankings and how some of them just completely ignore the draft and the draft picks, and everyone's just so hyper focused on like free agency. When everyone came in, it's like this free agent class stinks,
Yeah.
and then everyone's like, well, they sucked because they didn't sign any free agents. It's just very perplexing. So I've been getting my blood boiled, and I haven't been fighting with as many people as usual, but
Well, it's funny because there's a couple things we're going to talk about today. One, Jeff, I have landed on my Seahawks pick at 18. Like, I'm not waffling anymore. I know who I want them to take. I'm going to tell you why and who. Uh, I've landed pretty close to what I think is my probably will not change draft strategy going into that. So we'll talk about that as well. I want to hear your thoughts. And then I think we're going to start by talking about obviously I reacted to Ben Solak free agent rankings. We might talk about that a little bit. We're going to kind of give our own grades to teams. We're not going to do all 32 teams, but we'll pick out some ones that stood out to us, good and bad. But before we even get there, I want to react to some of these over under totals and some of
yeah,
the stuff at FanDuel because look, you and I were talking about okay, we're going to talk about the over under totals for wins for teams. We're going to do that. But dude, I pulled up FanDuel this morning and I see they also have like likelihood of conference winners and division winners as
yeah.
well. And I don't know where to start with how much this bothers me. But the 49ers are the odds-on favorite to win the division. The Rams are second, and the 49ers are plus 150. The Rams are plus 185, so pretty close. The Seahawks are plus 500. The Cardinals are plus 460. The Seahawks are the least likely team to win the division. What are we talking about here? If you get to conference winners, the 49ers are the third most likely team to win the NFC. They've got the Eagles at plus 290, then the Lions at plus 500. Makes sense. And then it goes to the Niners at plus 900. And guess what? The Rams are tied with them at plus 900. The Commanders are behind them. Like, the Commanders were in the NFC Championship last year. And is there any reason to think they're going to be worse this year?
It's perplexing. It's almost like they read David Lombardi's tweets for the last month and based their whole odds of, because anyone who's followed the 49ers has seen what's happened to their team. And like, I got hints of it. I'm sure you did being around Grant. What was going to happen with all their beat reporters were like, Jed York is very mad about the Brandon Ayuk contract and they're going to cut spending. And all of a sudden, first it was Deebo Samuel, but the amount of players they lost, and they couldn't even add Joey Bosa, who was Nick Bosa's brother, who was like, all the reporters were like, oh, he's definitely coming to San Francisco. So they haven't not added a single player of substance. And I know they still have a pretty good core of blue chip players, but there are a lot of them are aging too. Like Christian McCaffrey, can you bet on him being healthy? Brandon Ayuk's coming off knee surgery. Trent Williams, people thought he might not play this year. Brock Purdy's going through a contract negotiation that might go deep into the summer. So where are these parts of that team they lost? If you've looked at their defense, now they are very well set up in the draft. They have a lot of picks.
They do. Not as many as the Seahawks.
Not as many in terms of like quality either. Like the Seahawks have more top 100 picks than any team in the league.
Yeah.
So, and this is not a blue chip kind of draft. This is more of a depth, trenches. And when you look at the Niners defense, like if you go through that depth chart, I don't know if you've had a chance to do it.
Oh, we're going to do that. We're going to friggin' do that.
And like Robert Saleh's defense, a big part of the defense, he's the coordinator there now, is getting pressure with a 4-man rush. And we saw splits before they had Nick Bosa, when they had Armstead and they had Buckner. When they didn't have like a dominant group of rushers, basically 3 top 10 picks, their defense was terrible. And now they still have Nick Bosa, who's as elite as he gets, but you look who's around him, and there's nothing. There's nothing. They cut Javon Hargrave. They lost Leonard Floyd. Both weren't even good last year. They have
Malik Collins.
Malik Collins was released. So it's
Kevin Givens.
Gross Matos.
Yep.
Kevin Givens. So the whole defense is based on a 4-man rush, and they have 1 rusher. They have no interior rushers. They lost their second linebacker. They lost their best corner. They lost their best safety. I don't get it. Like, I would have guessed their over-under would be like 2 to 3 wins less. And yes, they still have high-end talent, but it looks like that's a planned step back kind of season. It's shocking that that's gone over the odds makers' heads.
Well, we'll talk about what we think the over-under should be for each of these teams. We haven't actually revealed the over-under yet, but I think that the 49ers have a legitimate shot to win the division. So I don't want to get this twisted as like, oh, this is just, Seahawks fans crapping on the 49ers. I like doing that too, and I won't hesitate to do it, but 49ers have more blue chip players on their roster than still any team in the division. Period.
No doubt.
That's just a reality. But they won 6 games last year, and I don't think there's a strong case to be made that, like, you could say, oh, they were injured. Well, a lot of the guys that were injured are gone now and aren't going to be back at all.
Yeah.
Like Hufanga, like Greenlaw, you go on. Trent Williams is 70,000 years old. He's not going to get healthier this season. And Christian McCaffrey, do you know any running backs that have been injured throughout their career that get less injured as they approach 30 years old? That's not a thing. So, yes, they have, if everything goes perfectly for them health-wise, they can be a real handful. But to your point, they're deep. We're going to go through that depth chart. That defense is rough, dude. It's rough.
And that's when they were in the Super Bowls, they had the best roster in the league by a significant margin. But age and draft talent, and they really saw last year the start of that Trey Lance hit from giving up all those draft picks to get Trey Lance, and the depth of their team was kind of exposed. And again, they're the core of blue chip players that they amassed during the Super Bowl. attempts that they lost both all those times, but was insane. Like the amount of players they get, like teams dream of that. But Trent Williams is going to be 37 this year. You were joking.
Yeah. No.
37.
That's yeah.
Christian
He's freaky.
McCaffrey's Christian McCaffrey's been in the league since 2017. Like there's guys like Dalvin Cook was in the same draft class, Leonard Fournette. They're out of the league now. Like running backs
Mm-hmm.
of that age tail off very quickly. Like Zeke Elliott was drafted a year before. Like look what he's and we're not knocking these guys. They've amassed Bosa and Warner and all these guys, but what made them so good is they also had Eric Armstead and they had Dre Greenlaw. We saw in that Super Bowl, the second
DeForest
Dre Greenlaw,
Buckner.
DeForest Buckner, like that 2019 team was played Richard Sherman, like Charvarius Ward played very good football for them. Hafungo in
All
2022
pro.
and 2023, he was arguably one of their best players. Brandon Ayuk was a player worthy of a $30 million a year contract.
Mm-hmm.
Debo Samuel, like these are not just like nothing burger players. And they had a good draft last year. I will acknowledge they did have a good draft last year.
Yeah, they
They
did.
had a lot of talent to their building, but the years before, and like there's so much energy spent on like comp picks, and no one amassed better comp pick capital than the Niners. And me and you were very worried about it. If you look at like who they drafted with, and they got a lot of third rounders because they lost a lot of the black coaches or GMs. They went to other teams. They had a lot of them. They had, I think, 4 different ones. And so they got 2 third-round picks multiple times. And you know what they ended up with? Jake Moody, Danny Gray, Jair Brown, a cornerback, Ambry Thomas. They whiffed on basically every one of them. So this team could have been really well set up for this kind of transition. And then what happened was this also had to do with this spending issue. They really cut their cash budget this year because they have to sign Purdy. And so they let a lot of talent out of that building. And their
Yeah.
depth chart is bare bones right now on defense.
So I talked about the NFC odds. Again, Eagles plus 290, Lions plus 500. Then it goes to the 49ers and the Rams plus 900, which is just wild to me that the Rams and 49ers are equal. Then the Commanders. I'm much higher on the Commanders, I think, than others. Like, I think Jaden Daniels is for real. I'm guessing maybe some people are thinking, well, CJ Stroud had a tough sophomore year. Maybe that won't. Maybe they'll get exposed because they're a little gimmick. Dude, that guy was really, really good. I don't think defenses are just going to solve Jaden Daniels and what he can do, like, like it's some kind of gimmicky formula. So, and I think their young guys will get better. I think they'll add. We'll talk about their free agency. I don't know, man. I'm higher on the Commanders than I am on the 49ers at this point.
Oh, yeah. I don't think it's close right now. You look at the AFC and what's dominating the AFC every year. It's the great quarterback. Josh Allen, Lamar, Mahomes. You had a glimpse of CJ Stroud. You've had other Justin Herbert's always hanging around. But that's what the AFC is. It's the same teams every year. At the end of the year, Lamar, and it's kind of been that way. The NFC doesn't have those guys. It's been the great teams. It's been the Brock Purdy, the Jared Goff. The closest thing to one of those quarterbacks, in my opinion, is Jaden Daniels. And if he's as good as, obviously you said the Stroud example, but if he's as good as that guy, and he looked like one of those dudes last year.
He looked like an forget Stroud, dude. He looked like an MVP. He looked like the
That's
best player in football.
and that's why I mentioned that group. So if you have one of those guys, you're a Super Bowl contender every year.
Yeah,
And they
for
added
sure.
Laramie Tunsil, and they Dan Quinn like looked like an excellent coach. They kept Cliff Kingsbury. Like
Mm-hmm.
they're a team that seems that they might even be better set up than the Rams. So
Yeah,
I think they're the team that you think is going to be ascending for a long time. It's because they have the great young quarterback.
yeah, agreed there. So that goes to the Commanders, and then the Packers. They're plus 950. Then the Packers are plus 1100. I get that. I got no problems with that. I think the Packers really blew it toward the end of the year, but I think they're one of the more talented young teams. I don't. We'll talk about their free agency, but the Bucks at plus 1500 also don't have a huge problem with that.
Yeah.
They had some injuries and they still were pretty plucky last year. Jeff, do you care to guess after? Okay, so the after the Bucks at plus 1500, where do you think the next most likely team is to win the NFC by odds?
3,000.
Well, who?
The Vikings,
Vikings are one of them. They actually no, sorry. The Vikings are not the next one. They are the one after the next one. Who
not
would
the
be above the
Vikings.
Vikings?
The Bears.
The Bears. The Chicago Bears are plus 1800. I'm impressed that you guessed the Bears.
The way gambling odds tend to work is they tend to try to suck people in based on which the Niners thing be even more perplexing. The way like done some work with FanDuel in the draft, they tend to want to get like that the hot team, the hot story. And so Ben Johnson, they had a very good offseason so far, in my opinion. And so Caleb Williams, it seems like kind of the sucker's bet where they want all these people to be like, oh, Bears are really good odds. Like they're not going to win the Super NFC next year. But that was my logic on it. I'm surprised the Vikings are under them
The
though.
Vikings are plus 1900.
Vikings had
The
a very
Bears are plus.
headline buzzy free agency. So
Well, that's part of the thing. I mean, would you bet on Caleb Williams with his supporting cast and his coaching to be a guy that could lift his team to an NFC championship, like to go to the Super Bowl? Or would you bet on JJ McCarthy and his supporting staff to lift the team? I don't like either of those choices, to be honest.
let's just say Evan would bet on the Bears, which means it's a horrible bet.
For people
And
that don't know, anything Evan bets on is guaranteed to lose, and it was very hard to watch him sports bet this past year. And when he put money on the Cardinals to beat the Rams in that game, we needed the Cardinals to win. I put all this money on the Rams just to try to counteract Evan's negative mojo. It almost worked, but it
they
didn't.
should have won that game too.
Oh my god. Yeah, I don't know. I'm not buying the Bears, dude. Like, I think they'll be better. I think Caleb Williams has got bigger problems than his offensive line, than the coaching. I think he's got issues. I think he's talented, but I don't think he's going to be Jaden Daniels level play just because he's got all these other things that have clicked around him.
Yeah, and I don't think it's a 1 year fix.
That's
A
right.
lot of things that you brought up, I didn't watch Caleb Williams closely in college, and a lot of things you brought up, I watched him very closely last year. I found him very frustrating, and some of it was coaching for sure. They had Shane Waldron there, who was an odd fit, but he just didn't seem in command. And like there was multiple times, there was that big thing on Thanksgiving where the coach didn't call the timeout, but like he didn't know how to run a basic situation. And then there was a Seahawks game where what was it 6-3 or I can't even remember that game. There was multiple situations he did not know how to manage at a
Mm-hmm.
basic. And look, their offensive line wasn't good. They don't have a great running back. They had a lot invested in receiver. They built their team very poorly, but I don't see a guy that you're just going to drop in there and all of a sudden they're a contender. I think they have to really build an infrastructure for him. I think they've taken the first step, but to see this happen in year one, I think it's going to take time, and I think that they're on the right path. But I don't see a team that's like, oh, these guys could win the Super Bowl. They could win the NFC this year. Like, I think we're a couple years away from that.
So that's the Bears, and then it goes Vikings. A team I haven't mentioned yet, the Seahawks, who were the only 10-win team to not make the playoffs, right? And one of the only 10-win teams to not make the playoffs in like decades. Like there's only a handful of them that haven't done it. All right. So you'd think, oh, well, the Seahawks maybe are next. No, they're not next. In fact, after the Bears and the Vikings, the Cardinals are a higher bet, like higher odds. They're plus 2,200 to get to win the NFC. To win the NFC. The Seahawks are after them at plus 2,600. So a pretty far gap between the Cardinals and the Seahawks. I don't get the Cardinals thing, man. Like they had everything that they could want from a draft capital perspective the last 3 years. Marvin Harrison Jr. was not a bust, but he was a bust based on the expectations for him last year. Kyler Murray just shits the bed every single time it matters. He falls apart. He is terrible in the big moments. He's terrible against the best teams. Like you're as good as Kyler Murray can make you. And they have a bad defense. What am I missing with the Arizona Cardinals?
It's like everyone remember that movie Men in Black where like they get the thing that like destroys their like brain. They shoot the
Yes.
thing. It's like
Yes.
every offseason, everyone in the media or the odds makers gets this thing with the Cardinals and they shoot it and they break their brain and they can't remember what happens every single season. Everyone in the media last year was like in love with the Cardinals draft, and me and you were like, "Are we missing something here?" Like they blew it. And then they get into the season, and all these people are like, oh, the Cardinals get into heavy personnel, and they can run down everyone's throat. And then they play the Seahawks, and James Conner runs 7 yards, 7 carries or 8 yards. It's like, how much more evidence do we need that this team is just, they are what they are? Like, they have some talented players, like Trey McBride and Marvin Harrison, cool players for sure. But, like, what signs and what evidence has changed from last year? It's the same team, basically. They got one. We'll talk about their free agency. They added a solid rotational edge rusher. He's a good player. Could have been the MVP of the Super Bowl. But when you take that guy off the Eagles and dump him on Arizona, you think that's gonna like make them give them an extra couple wins? Like they're the exact same team. It's
Yeah.
perplexing. Like the Cardinals have been this. Whether it was Cliff Kingsbury, it's the Kyler Murray thing. Like this is what they are. Like they're gonna show some cool plays. They're going to win some games. They're going to end up with 7 to 9 wins. They're not going to be competitive. If they make the playoffs, they're going to get blown out. It's the same story. Like, they're not picking very high in the draft. They don't have a lot of. We said last year, like, that was their real chance to kind of elevate the team. I think Daniel Jeremiah tweeted, like, this could really set up their future. And I remember looking at their draft class, and it's like.
You and I did not like it.
No, and I looked and
Max
it was like
Melton.
they took a corner that wasn't very impactful in the second round. They took a backup tight end. They took a backup running back.
Yeah. Trey Benson.
Trey Benson and Tip Ryman we thought was like a good fifth rounder. He won the end of the third. They took a safety.
So such a reach.
And we're like, they're acting like they have a Super Bowl team and they're adding depth and what they could have come out of that draft, like even like Mustafa or like even Barner would be an upgrade for them. It just didn't feel like they took that chance. I feel like a wasted opportunity. And really, they haven't progressed. Really, they won an extra game probably from the year before, extra couple games. They've gone from 4th pick to 16th pick. But to make the next jump, like that would be a horrible bet.
I'll tell you a team, Jeff, that we'll get back to the Cardinals when we get, and the Seahawks when we do the over/under here in a little bit. But a team that I think people are sleeping on. If I'm putting money, and I'm not recommending anyone does this, but this is what I would do on a team to shock everybody and make beat the odds. They're plus 3,100 to win the NFC right now.
Yeah,
it's the Atlanta Falcons. I think the Atlanta Falcons already had a top 10 offense last year. I think it's going to be one of the most dynamic offenses in football. I think Bijan Robinson, Michael Penix, Drake London, I think that's going to be a very special offense. And I think it already started to be at the end of last year. Their defense is what's got to be figured out.
Yeah.
I think that's a legitimate thing. We'll see what happens for them in the draft. But I think that offense is going to be a handful. I think they have a little bit of the Washington Commanders in them for next year.
They do, and the one thing that I would pause on them is their defense is terrible.
It is really bad.
And like if you look at like their history of like top 10 picks and what they could have had and like their personnel decisions, like they're one of the worst run franchises. This is exactly why I hated the Kirk Cousins thing with Penix last year. Is now they have Michael Penix on a rookie contract and they can't even take advantage of it.
Right.
Because they got that Boulders in there, which should all be going to defense or offensive line, and they lost Drew Dalman. But I think Penix, when you saw the glimpses of him last year, he looks special in that offense. And Bijan Robinson is so good. They have the pieces there. They spent so much top 10 capital where they took Kyle Pitts over Penei Sewell and Jamar Chase, who are two of the best players in the whole league. Kyle Pitts is on last year's deal, and they just spent so much capital on that offense, so they better be good. But I look at that defense and like the amount of pass rushers they passed up year after year after year, and then they pay for Leonard Floyd again, and it's like you're looking at their defense and it's like Jesus.
Yeah.
And then Raheem Morris can't manage the clock and things like that. But they are going to be an ascending team because of, again, I talked about before. More than anything, we can spend all this time on defense and all this stuff. What matters is quarterback. And if you have a good quarterback, you're going to be a competitive team. And I'd far rather bet on them than Arizona.
I don't think anybody would have said. I think people would have said exactly what you just said about the Commanders last year. The defense looked like to be horrible. Like did not have anybody. Like I don't think most people could name a single player on that defense last year when the season started. And I think people forget that Penix went toe to toe with Jaden Daniels in Washington in a game that mattered for both teams, and like was right there. Like they were like he led that drive to take the lead. That was very impressive. So I think that team's a lot better than people give it credit for. But I have to do Super Bowl odds, and then we'll get to over unders. Then we'll get to our free agency stuff. So Super Bowl odds as of now, Eagles are the favorite, then the Ravens, then the Bills, then the Chiefs, then the Lions. Like so far, pretty chalky. Then the Commanders, which is a little odd given what the odds are for the NFC. Then the Bengals. The Bengals are actually tied with the Commanders at plus 1,800. That's a little wild to me. We'll talk about whether the Bengals have they improved themselves at all to a team that, last I checked, didn't make the playoffs last year. And then after the Bengals, the Rams and the 49ers are ahead of the Packers, the Chargers, the Texans, the Bucks, the Broncos. So the Rams and the 49ers are basically being treated by the odds makers as equivalent teams.
Good God.
I don't know about that. And again, Bears, Vikings, the Cardinals, the Steelers, the Dolphins, all ahead of the Seahawks. The Bears, the Broncos, the Cardinals, the Steelers, the Dolphins, all ahead of the Seahawks for Super Bowl odds. The Seahawks are down there with the Dallas Cowboys, Jacksonville Jaguars, New England Patriots. Like that's the level that they've got them at as a Super Bowl team.
It's almost as if nobody remembers the Seahawks defense exists.
Thank you.
Almost.
Thank you.
I saw someone tweet out to like Mina and Danny Kelly, and Danny's not using Twitter anymore, so Danny's not going to see it. It's like, can someone talk about the Seahawks defense? Like everyone's losing their minds. It's almost they forget what the core of this team is. And I think the defense didn't really lose a player of substance. They added DeMarcus Lawrence to take on Draymond Jones, and they basically brought back the whole defense. And it's a young group that's ascending. It's not a lot of old guys like San Francisco's offense. Like their defense gives them a very high floor alone. And it's not like they have like a complete, like if it was like Sam Howell a quarterback right now and they had no draft picks, it'd be like, okay, I get it. Like they should be there. But it's almost like people forget the draft exists. And like in all this analysis, it's been so frustrating because the Seahawks have this defense and then they have a huge stack of capital to boost into their offense. And historically, we've seen it. Look at Washington. What would Washington have odds have been at this time last year? As low as they could get. They would have been last on the list probably. People forget the draft is what raises ceilings. It's not free agency. Free agency is more about the floor typically and filling holes. And like everyone's so focused on like the vibes of this team right now and the Geno to Darnold thing. And it's like the Seahawks to me is like if they have a good draft, and it's a big if obviously, but they shoot past a lot of these teams because of what that defense is. Mm-hmm. And that defense alone gives them a huge ceiling over someone like Arizona, which I don't see any way. Like if the Seahawks take the second-year jump that we saw with McDonald in Baltimore, like that gives them a way to be a really competitive. Like there's not a lot of great defenses in the NFL right now, and the Seahawks basically have everyone back. So I'm perplexed by the odds makers. I'm perplexed they even released these before the draft. because maybe they're just trying to get suckers money out of people, but so much of this comes down to the draft, and so much of how a team gets great becomes like even Atlanta. Like you mentioned, Atlanta, they don't get Penix. Like how bad is that team looking?
Yeah,
So
yeah,
a lot of this with all this draft stock they've accumulated and what they've done on defense, it's perplexing that they're looked at like the Cowboys who've just gone to a bare bones roster. They paid all these guys and they're left in no man's land with Brian Schottenheimer, who's never been a head coach. Like I'm scratching my head that maybe they're just reading all the articles, and it seems like there's a group of people that's just very out on what the Seahawks have done. I'm not in that camp, but there is certainly reason to be skeptical. But I think even if you don't like the moves, it's like they haven't really done that on defense. That's what the team's about. That's what the coach is about. It's like
yeah.
we're not having the conversation we should be having.
No, I think people are. There's a lot of. I don't know a better word for it than butthurt. Like people are just they do not like the Geno to Darnold change, and that by itself has overshadowed everything else. That plus the fact that they still haven't addressed the offensive line. Those two things. And by the
Very
way, I
fair
think
criticism.
both
Yeah.
those two things are totally fair criticisms. Like I don't think
Yeah.
either one of us are blind to the implications there. But this was a
No.
10 win team last year with an ascending defense. This defense, every indication is this defense should be better, maybe a lot better this year than it was last year. And I think that there is, because of how extremely off the offense was and how much it, I think to use Robert Mays' term, left the offensive line out to bake in the sun as opposed to giving them any cloud cover with a decent run game, with like proper play action, with other things like that. It was as bad as it, I think, could have been set up to be last year. I think there's every reason to think this could be a top half of the league offense. I absolutely think that's a realistic thing to expect. That's like 15th. I'm not saying that maybe they're not going to be a top 10 offense, but if you pair that with a top 5 defense, you're winning 10 or 11 games.
Yeah.
Period.
And they have a pretty light schedule this year.
They do.
They're playing the NFC South and the AFC South.
So, I mean, we'll see what comes. Obviously, the draft is going to be a huge impact on this, but let's get to win totals because we've talked about it a lot. They've got the San Francisco 49ers as 10.5, over under 10.5, which is a big number, dude. It's a big number. And by the way, the odds are equal, -110 on over and on under. So they're basically like, they think they've pretty much nailed based on where the bets are coming in. The 49ers are going to be a 10 or 11 win team.
I watched the show yesterday and went through the over-unders, and they were both giggling when they saw the 49ers number.
Who?
Bill Simmons and Cousin Sal did the show where they went through all the over-unders. They predicted what they thought they were going to be. They said 6.5 for the Niners. And when they revealed 10, they were both giggling like hyenas. And they're like, if I can advise anything, bet all your money on the under. Now, I'm not going to tell you to bet your money because I don't want to be. I don't know what they'll do in the draft, but I think they're at the same level as the Lions. I think the Lions were 10.5. And the Lions had the best roster in the NFL last year. They basically have everyone back. They're getting a lot healthier. Like, how can you think? And we have a 6-win team that lost their whole depth.
Well, and the Lions, you're right, they're 10.5. They are plus 120 to go over 10.5. They're -140 to go under. If I'm reading that right, like people are taking the under, right?
Yeah. Well, I'm guessing they're thinking the Ben Johnson loss is going to be a big impact on Jared Goff.
The implication there, though, is that the Lions are worse than the 49ers.
Exactly, which is insane to me. Insane. We had one that was the number 1 seed in the league last year versus a 6-win team that just lost their whole depth chart.
By comparison, the Kansas City Chiefs are 11.5. One game better than the 49ers. Like, I get the Chiefs have some question marks, but they still have Patrick Mahomes and they still have a great defense.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I don't know how you have the Chiefs and the 49ers in the same stratosphere.
It's insane. It's that's what I mean. I almost wonder if they just been reading David Lombardi and they're like, oh, things sound like they're going great there. They have this genius plan to match what the Rams did, and they have the best tight end group in the league, and things are going great. Because everyone else around the 49ers are like, this is disaster potential.
The Eagles are plus 11 and a half. So again, like
One game better.
one game better. I find that to be crazy. The Rams are 9.5 as their over under, and the over is where the money's coming in. It's negative 140. Under is plus 120.
Yeah.
So people are betting up the Rams on 9.5. I would have guessed, Jeff, coming into this, I would have guessed the Rams were the favorite in the division.
If I was doing the odds, the Rams would definitely be the favorite. I would think they would be the 10.5 team.
Yeah. I think I'd actually have been fine with 9.5 for the Rams and that being tops in the division.
Yeah, like the Rams were the closest team. Like I thought the Rams in the season looked very questionable. They played well in the playoffs, and they were the closest team to being the Eagles. They brought Stafford back. They made some solid moves in free agency. They lost some guys. They probably upgraded a couple spots, but just with McVay and the whole thing they've got going on there, they were pretty good. The defensive line they've accumulated, they at least that defensive line and Puka, like they're ascending in a lot of areas. I don't know about the quarterback, but that's the bet I would think the odds makers would see versus the Niners who are descending in a lot of areas and a lot of
Mm-hmm.
key areas where they're getting older. Like when in that in football does that work? It's shocking to me that they've come to this conclusion.
Yeah, I mean the Rams are going to have a first place schedule,
Yeah.
which will matter a little bit. I, they have the reason for me 9.5 is fine. Like I'm actually fine with it. Is Matt Stafford is just it's a question mark, man. He just
Yeah.
is, and uh, I think Brock Purdy is more of a question mark than people want to admit, based off when he didn't have the All Star crew around him at the end of last year. That guy looked really bad. Like
Very ordinary.
there were some really, really rough games for him to end last year. And I've been kind of a proponent of his all along. Well, anyway, so 49ers are 10.5, Rams are 9.5. Both the Cardinals and the Seahawks are 8.5. And the Cardinals are getting negative 25 on the under 8.5. The Seahawks, negative 140.
On
So
the under.
on the under. So the money's coming in heavily. Like the money is leading toward the Seahawks being an under 8.5 win team.
Vegas and the odds makers, they don't seem to get the Seahawks. Like last year, the
That's the
sharps
easiest bet of
was the
any.
easiest bet of the year. They had them at 7.5.
Yep.
No one understood it. Like every show I listened to was like, what are people smoking? People love Gino, like the cool kids in the media. And even though the offensive line and Grubb were a lot more screwed up than we would have hoped, they still easily cleared that. They got to 10. This year, where everyone's like, oh, the offseason's gone terrible, they lost Gino. Their odds went up from last year, a game higher. Like, the line went up a game higher. And
Mm-hmm.
even so, people are like, oh, this stinks. Like, I feel like this was the case after the Russell Wilson trade. Like, these guys are going to suck. And, like, the over-under, I think, was 5.5. And it just seems like they don't understand what's going on here. And there's so many loud voices in the media that get out there. And when you have a defense as good as Seattle's, and if with the 5 top 100 picks that can for them, I think could go into the offense. I think the over there is a pretty obvious pick, unless Darnold just completely is a disaster and the whole thing goes as bad as some people think. But under 8.5 assumes that you're going to drop 2-3 games from last year. Like I'm not seeing that with a lighter schedule. That doesn't compute to me at all.
No.
Like I think at the most case you level off or you get a game worse or you go back to where they were in 2023, assuming everything goes badly. But to drop 2-3 games, I don't understand that logic at all.
Yeah, it's a little wild to me. And I am pulling up the depth chart for the 49ers, and it's pretty crazy, dude.
I'm not lying.
I see this is their starting defense. Nick Bosa, Jordan Elliott, Evan Anderson, and Yatura Gross Matos on the line. D. Winters and Fred Warner at linebacker. Trey Brown, the former Seahawk, and Renardo Green as their top two corners, with Diamador Lenore, who's a good corner, as their nickel. And then Jair Brown and Malik Mustafa at safety. That's a bottom half of the league defense at
Yeah,
best. That could be a bottom third of the league defense.
that's a lot what the defense looked like in the early years of Shanahan. And everyone was calling for Robert Saleh to be fired in those years. And then we saw once you actually got the players in the defense worked really well. But that's what it looked like. They had Buckner and Armstead, a couple other guys, and then a bunch of dudes. And their defense sucked. Even when they brought Sherman in. Sherman had pretty good years at first, but it took them 3 years to get to the level they wanted to. Or 2 years. It took 2 years. And it just, I think people are kidding themselves. You look at that D line, and we've seen so much. You got a college free agent, Jordan Elliott, who's just like a career depth guy, and your Turgros Matos, who was like a do not draft guy, I remember from us from the Seahawks here in 2020, who hasn't done anything so far. Then you look at behind them, there's nothing behind them. And I don't think there's like a pass rusher at pick 11 that all of a sudden is going to change that core. There's mostly depth guys, and then the secondary is fine. Like Lenore and Bernardo Green looked pretty good last year, and Mustafa. They're at least ascending there, but
Mm-hmm.
Fred Warner is like he's had great year after great year. If he kind of steps back at all, and there's nothing behind any of these guys, so they're one injury away from total disaster. If Warner
Totally.
or Bosa goes out,
If Bosa goes out, they're going to be the worst defense maybe in the NFL. Like they'll be in that conversation.
and even when they had better depth last year, remember Bosa got hurt in that road game when you were at in San
Uh huh.
Francisco,
I
and
remember.
the
That's
splits
fun.
almost right away was shocking. Like they
Mm-hmm.
scored 2 touchdowns almost immediately, and that was when he had some decent guys around him. The Javon Hargrave thing didn't work for them. Leonard Floyd had some sacks, but we were right to criticize their offseason. Some 49ers writers were like, oh, look at all this talent they brought into their defensive line. We're like, none of these guys can stop the run. What are you talking about? What happened? They're one of the worst run-stopping fronts in the league
Yep.
last year. They haven't
Yep.
added a single player to it. And they lost
Let
their best linebacker and safety. So, like,
Let me quickly recap. And keep in mind, this was a free agency that Ben Solak graded higher than the Seahawks, okay? The 49ers lost Debo Samuel, lost Javon Hargrave, lost Travarius Ward, lost Leonard Floyd, lost Dre Greenlaw, lost Isaac Yadam, lost Joshua Dobbs, lost Brandon Allen, lost Demetrius Flanagan Fowles, lost Aaron Banks. So part of their starting lineup on offense. Lost Eric Saubert, who, I mean, how can they possibly replace him? They lost Rock Yassin, the cornerback. They lost Charlie Heck, a right tackle. They lost Nick McLeod, another cornerback. They lost Jalen Moore. They're really like their only backup to Trent Williams. They lost Talanoa Hufanga. They lost Elijah Mitchell, the running back. They lost Jordan Mason, the running back. The guys that were behind, the guys that they added, Jeff, like the guys that they added. Um, um
I'm looking at the
let's
list.
see.
Mac
I'm looking.
Jones.
Mac Jones, the tight end,
Luke Farrell.
Luke Farrell. Where is my list of 49ers? I'm scrolling. Here we go. Saron Neal, a cornerback. Richie Grant, a safety. Jason Pinnock, a safety. Demarcus Robinson, I think, is a good sign at receiver. I think I'd give them credit there. Trey Brown. John Weeks, a long snapper. They lost their long snapper, too. Luke Gifford, a linebacker from the Titans. Trey Tomlinson, a cornerback from the Rams. Wow. What?
Any list
Like,
that does not have them last or second last,
that's an F, dude.
that's as bad as you can ever get it with a free agency. They didn't add a single impact player. Demarcus Robinson, who I like, the receiver, like
Hmm.
the Rams were indicating there's some health or I mean some off the field issues that might be
Some
coming from
legal
the league
issues, maybe.
standpoint. Yeah, some
Yeah.
legal issues. So Trey Brown's a good flyer for them. They got him for nothing. Good for them. Like I would take a flyer on him if I was another team. I think that was a good move. The amount of quality they lost and they hadn't had a single impact starter and what their defensive line was 2 years ago to what it is now. Any free agent list that doesn't have them last, you can't have a worse free agent than that. Like that's as bad
That's
as you could ever
I
have.
give them the only like quality component of this to them is I think that they were right to move on from a lot of the either the older guys or just to fix their cap situation a little bit. I think it's like the right thing to do, but to call it anything other than an F from a talent perspective is bizarre to me. That is an FFF free agency for the 49ers.
And the weird part is it's not like you have to dig deep. It's dead obvious. It stares you right in the face when you look at that depth
Yeah.
chart. There's a lot of names. There's a lot of talent. Like I get if you're like, okay, they're finally resetting. They're finally acknowledging what happened last year. Sure. But there's no way that's looked at as like a positive. Like that's as devastating as a roster talent like deficit as you can have in free agency.
So tell me, who would you give an A to in free agency? Which team, or give me a couple of teams that you'd say I'm an A for this team.
I don't like complimenting this team very much. It's going to bother me. But the Denver Broncos, I thought
Mm.
Denver had an. We're talking about San Francisco's losses. They added Dre Greenlaw and Hufanga at safety, who I thought was one of the better buys in free agency in terms of just like he might be hurt, but at least like he has the ceiling that the free agency group didn't have. I thought they really rounded out their depth chart with those two. They went from Cody Barton to Dre Greenlaw, and me and you see Cody Barton a lot differently than some of the nerds that we don't see eye to eye with. And then they added Evan Ingram on offense, who I think could be a really good fit in that offense. So I think they did really well. Tampa Bay, I thought, did really well. I thought they brought back Chris Godwin, who seemed like they were going to lose him. They've had a problem with the edge rush, and they bought low on Hassan Reddick, who was such a disaster. But a couple of years ago, he was one of the better players in the league.
Mm-hmm.
I
Mm-hmm.
think the Bucks are one of like the sneaky best run teams in the league. Like they don't make a lot of bad. And then Ben Bredesen, even getting him back, like that was a guy they bought him before free agency. That was a guy I kind of liked before they switched schemes as just like a cheap veteran filler. They got their whole line coming back. I would give them.
They got Greg Gaines back.
Yeah, Greg Gaines back was the other one. I think they just did a really good job. The other one to me would be the Bears.
Okay.
I love what they did with their interior offensive line. I think that's the offseason we've all been waiting. And then they added some nice defensive pieces as well. Gray Jarrett. They paid a lot for that defensive lineman from Indianapolis, who's was a lot more Deo.
Odeyingbo.
Yeah, he's at least an ascending guy. I like that they took a shot on him. Again, they added interior offensive line and defensive line.
Mm-hmm.
To me, that's a good use of offseason money.
Yeah, it's like it's gonna be interesting with the Bears because the way that they went about their offseason so far, it screams that they should use their draft capital on defense.
Yeah.
But I still think that their ideal first pick in the draft would be a left tackle, or a tackle if like Campbell or Membu fell to them. Outside of that, though, the offense is pretty set, and the defense, though, to me is there's questions still there. They played pretty well at times last season, but and we'll see about what Grady Jarrett's got left in him at this stage. But yeah, I think that was a good offseason, I think, or so far.
So far, incomplete.
I think like one of my favorite, like what would you give them grade wise? Those different teams. Broncos,
I would give an A.
Bucks.
Bucks I would give an A because what they could have done and what they ended up with. I'd give the Bears a B plus.
Okay. So one of my favorites that I think I'd give an A to is the Lions.
Yeah, they were on my list. They were the next
The
tier on my
Lions,
list. Yeah.
I thought DJ Reed was one of the most impactful free agents available on the market. He seems to continue to go under the radar. He is a legitimate, you know, Pro Bowl level or better corner. And he's aging. Sure, he's 29, but I don't think he's like past the point of playing well.
It was only
They
a
paid,
3-year deal.
yeah, they paid less for him than the Patriots paid for Carlton Davis, who Reed replaces. And I think Reed's a better player. Carlton Davis is a good corner because he gets away with like grabbing people on every
Yeah.
single play. DJ Reed's like a legitimate cover corner. So I thought that was a fantastic addition to that. Already, like you put him with Brian Branch, you put him with that secondary that they've already like Terry and Arnold. Like I think that's a really good ad. I thought Avonte Maddox, the cornerback from the Eagles that they signed, is also an underrated player. I think he's a good ad there. And they also have their nickel corner, Meek Robertson, right?
Yeah, he's a good
Like
player.
he's excellent. He's excellent. So I think and then they've got their other safety, not Brian Branch, who was like one of the best safeties in football last year. So I think that's could end up being in the conversation for the best secondary in football. And then they added Roy Lopez, who I think is one of the best value signs, $3.5 million. I think he's going to be a rock in the middle of that line. So I think that was a really good ad. And then they brought back, guys like Dan Skipper, and they brought back Marcus Davenport on a cheap deal and Anzarike on a cheap deal. So this wasn't a matter of volume, but I thought that they were very smart in the dollars that they spent and the value that they're going to get for what they did. That to me is a free agency. It's not about how many players or how much you spend or how big the name is. Like, did you add good players at reasonable prices that you're not going to regret? And I think the Lions had one of the best off seasons in that regard.
Yeah, they were right in my next tier. I think I had DJ Reed and Roy Lopez circled on my list. So they both, I thought, me and you always go through a free agent list. We're like, all right, who's the value guy you want to buy low on that's going to provide value? They didn't buy low on DJ Reed, but Roy Lopez was the guy you circled. A couple of years ago, you had Shaq Barrett when he went to Tampa Bay, and like we're constantly looking for these guys. And too many teams focus on like what New England did, where they had $120 million,
Exactly.
and if you look at the list they signed, it's like for some people like, oh, that looks great, but for me, it's like they paid a lot for declining big names who aren't that good anymore, and it's not just that they're trying to build a team. Like it's not like Seattle where they're kind of filling out their spots at the end of the team. Like you can say, well, Seattle bought DeMarcus Lawrence and they bought Cooper Kupp, but their whole defense is like now being built on these kind of older, declining players. I thought New England is like an example of what not to do. I think Detroit was the opposite of that, and I think they bought the right guys at the right ages and the right prices. I think that's a really good call.
I don't have the Commanders as an A. I have them as like, I give them probably a B. But I like their offseason because, yes, Laramie Tunsil has now been traded twice. But what is something that a young franchise quarterback needs more than anything else? Good pass protection from especially their blind side. So Laramie Tunsil, when he's not doing whatever he does that gets him kicked off of whatever team he's on, is still a very talented left tackle, certainly more talented than the tackle they had last year. Then they get, I think, a sneaky decent signing. Nate Herbig is a guy that we've talked about as a guard. He's still a young guy, has not got a lot of snaps, could be someone that develops into something interesting. I think Dietrich Wise is a solid veteran edge player, cheap addition. I think Jonathan Jones, the cornerback they got from the Patriots, also a little bit older but cheaper, and I think is a fine addition to what secondary they need to build out. I don't think Javon Kinlaw is anything like amazing, but I think he proved out he can be a decent interior defensive lineman last year for the Jets. I also like Eddie Goldman from the Falcons. I don't think he's like the best thing ever, but I think he's fine. And I like Jacob Martin, the edge player they got from the Bears. I'm not huge on Debo Samuel.
I
You
was
know,
waiting for it. I was waiting.
like
For
I'm
it.
not. I think like that to me was maybe not their best move. But generally speaking, I feel like they went for the level of players. Like Tunsil is the jewel of their like free agency period, and then they went for like cheap solid guys for the most part. The Kinlaw contract is ridiculous. So I think that's a way big overpay. But generally speaking, I think they got some solid players at reasonable prices that are going to make them a better team.
Yeah, like I thought they did some good things. I thought they did some perplexing things. So
Yeah,
I thought Kinlaw was up there with the worst contracts handed out in free
100%.
agency. And look, Adam Peters was around him when they drafted him in San Francisco. They know him well, but like I don't think a lot of people from San Francisco were like clinging to bring him back. Well, Saleh brought him to the Jets. They didn't sign him, so they replaced him with Jonathan Allen, basically the same price. So, bit perplexing there. That one didn't really make sense to me. But as much as I am questioning Debo as a player, I actually think he fits really well there. Like Cliff Kingsbury ran more screens, I think, than anyone. And in that kind of collegey, gimmicky offense, I actually think Debo fits. I don't know what Debo has physically left. I think there's only like they don't take on a lot of term in that deal. So I think that was actually a pretty good buy for them in terms of what can fit in that offense, what they need to complement what they have with Terry McLaurin already. I think he actually fits quite well. And Tunsil, yeah, there's some definite questions there, but if you have a rookie quarterback, that's where you can take on a higher priced player. And they have Bobby Wagner and Zach Ertz and like the leaders Dan Quinn and like the leadership in that room is awesome. So I think you can kind of take some shots on guys like that. They're in that window. That's kind of what you're supposed to do when you have the quarterback on the rookie contract. You look at like Houston and Atlanta, and it's where it's like, well, what are you guys doing? This is when you gotta kind of, and that's what the Vikings did with McCarthy. They took on some older players on the offensive defensive line, but I think the Vikings took on a lot more risk than the Washington did from an injury standpoint and age standpoint. But yeah, I think the Commanders. I have a lot of respect for Adam Peters and Dan Quinn and what they're building there. I thought their offseason free agency last year approach with kind of the mid-level market was really good. This year they took on some bigger swings. So I didn't love Kinlaw. I thought Debo and Tunsil were pretty good risks, pretty good bets for them.
All right, we're gonna do some rapid fire here. I'm gonna give you a couple. If you have a couple, feel free. So the Bills. I thought the Bills had an interesting free agent period. I thought I like Michael Hoyt, and I know he's performance enhancing and suspended, whatever. But I think that ultimately is going to be a good addition for that Bills lineup, defensive side. I like Joey Bosa as a flyer, as a guy that can be a rotational rusher for them. I think Josh Palmer is a totally Bills kind of receiver to add. And I even like Larry Ogunjobi from the Steelers on the defensive line. So I liked what the Bills did. I don't think it was an A, but I liked. I'd probably give it a solid B for what they did. The Vikings are a team, obviously, that got a lot of discussion. I don't know, Jeff. When I look at the Vikings, just to quickly go through it, they added Jonathan Allen, they added Javon Hargrave, they added Jordan Mason, Ryan Kelly, Will Fries, Rondell Moore at receiver, Jeff Okudah at corner. I think, like, to me, it's a bit of a red flag when two guys from a team that could use some interior offensive linemen lets them go. But I don't know. I'm like a B, like on the Vikings. Where are you with the Vikings?
I'm lower. I'm gonna do a B minus.
Yeah.
One of the things that people do in free agency is they think what people used to be, and they look at name value, and they really focus on that. And a lot of like the personnel exercises, and we'll say like, okay, you're betting on what they're going to be now, and the price they're paying them to be is really important. So they added a lot of name value and a lot of money. So Ryan Kelly was a all-pro level center a couple of years ago. Javon Hargrave, Jonathan Allen, first-round picks. A lot of value at the right spots. But there's a lot of, like, Hargrave's coming off an injury-riddled couple of years. Ryan Kelly, an injury-riddled couple of years. Jonathan Allen's been beat up. Like, no one wanted to trade him at $16 million a year, and then they paid him more than $16 million a year. Obviously, I like the Will Fries addition. I think that makes sense. They had a lot of interior offensive line issues, and I commend them for trying to spend and fix that offensive line. So at that point, they did really well, but they don't have any quarterback the depth to protect. Like, I actually thought Daniel Jones would have been a good signing for them. He chose to go to the Colts. if JJ McCarthy isn't ready, or if they don't have a plan B.
No.
And so that part of it I don't love. I commend them for it. If you spend on the trenches, it's good. But when you look at the collective group, it's a lot of injury risk, declining players, and why historically franchises and teams don't like building too much through free agency is a year or two down the road, you end up with just a crippled group of expensive players. And I'll bring it to the Seahawks level. Like Tim Ruskell spent a lot on free agency at the end of his tenure here. They had Patrick Kearney and Deion Grant and some fun Nate Burleson, Deion Branch. They were fun, big names. For 2007, a lot of those guys hit and were good. But by 2008, you had this injury-riddled team, and it happened to the Vikings in a different decade. When you become two, and the Vikings have just 3 or 4 draft picks this year, that is not a historically way to build a team. And I get they're trying to take advantage of the rookie contract, but Hargrave and Kelly, and like it's good to have some veteran experience, but man, that's a lot of injury risk they took on.
All right, we're going to get to the rest of the NFC West. I will quickly say I give the Steelers an F. I think, what the hell are they doing? Trading a second round pick for DK Metcalf, signing him to that deal. Looks like they are locked in at Aaron Rodgers. Like they need Aaron Rodgers to sign with them, or even if they do that, it's still an F to me. I don't know what they're thinking. But let's talk about the rest of the NFC West. So the Rams for me I'd give them like an A minus. I like that they added Poona Ford. That's the one that I thought was a really good addition. I thought bringing back Alaric Jackson at the price that they were able to do it at was really good. That was a really good deal for them. I think bringing back Jimmy Garoppolo, I'm not a huge Jimmy guy, but I think that was smart. At $3 million a year as like your insurance policy, I think was smart. I don't like the Tutu Atwell contract, but I think he's a good guy for them to bring back. I don't love the Devontae Adams deal at $22 million, but he's still a player that can play, and that Sean McVay has some idea of how he wants to use him. So, and I thought bringing back Akella Witherspoon was smart as well. So for me, like A minus, I would give them on free agency.
Yeah, I had them and the Lions in the same tier in the whole list I made on my phone. So I'd say them B plus, because they lost some guys. Like they got Puna, but they lost Bobby Brown. Like kind of similar roles. I'm not sure who's better at this point, but when you lose someone like Bobby Brown, who's an important guy in their defense, and you plop in Puma, it's a really good way to kind of fill that hole. I think Devontae Adams is an upgrade on Cooper Kupp in the sense that he's probably going to be healthier. He's a year older than Cooper Kupp, but Kupp, if you watch his film last year, when he's healthy, Kupp looked really good, but Kupp struggled with injuries really badly the last 3 years, and availability is a big deal. And Kupp, when he was healthy, there was a couple games last year he looked as good as he's ever looked. But at the end of last year, the injuries seemed to really wear on him, and by December, I think Devontae Adams was playing at a far higher level than Cooper Kupp did. So I don't love the money they spent there, but I think it's a better bet just health-wise. And Alaric Jackson, I thought, was an excellent contract, and I don't think they did any things that left me really scratching my head. I think overall it was a solid. Last year, like they got out of Jonah Jackson pretty quick. Like that deal did not work out for them. Other than that, yeah, I think they're building in the right way. I think they got Matt Stafford back at probably a lower number than people would have thought. I don't know if we've seen the number yet, but it's supposed to be around $40 million a year. And now Geno might lap Matt Stafford, but Geno hasn't been close to the player Matt Stafford did. So I think the fact they brought Stafford back, they made some upgrades at spots that they've had some injury issues. I think, yeah, fairly good offseason. B plus for me.
All right, Cardinals. Have to go quick here, Jeff, because I got to get off here in a few minutes. But
Yep.
Cardinals, they lost Zach Pascal. They lost Kyrie's Tonga, the defensive lineman. They lost Naquan Jones, Roy Lopez. So far, they have not brought back Will Hernandez. Victor Dimukeji is maybe their bigger loss on the edge. He was one of their better edge players. They brought back Baron Browning. They brought back LJ Collier. They added Josh Sweat and Jacoby Brissett as a backup quarterback and Simi Fehoko as a wide receiver. That's it. For me, this is like a C minus.
Yeah, I'm C minus. They didn't really do anything to really upgrade their team. They're pretty much the same spot they were. Joshua was a good addition.
It's a good addition. He's
I
fine.
don't think he's a needle mover for a team like theirs. I think he's a good, like if they signed Boye Mafe, for example, as a free agent, I'd have the same kind of opinion. Like I don't think it's going to change much about what Arizona is. They need some needle movers to get better, and they didn't really do it. They're kind of the same team they were last year, and they lost some depth in some key spots. So yeah, it's a C minus for me.
All right, so Seahawks. We'll get to the Seahawks here. Geno Smith traded, DK Metcalf traded, Draymond Jones let go, Roy Robertson Harris let go, Pharaoh Brown goes to the Dolphins, Artie Burns goes, Laken Tomlinson goes. By the way, Texans F.
Oh my
Um,
god.
Trey Brown goes to the 49ers, Stone Forsythe goes to the Giants. As far as additions for the Seahawks, I think we know what their auditions are, but you've got Sam Darnold, you've got Cooper Kupp, you've got Shamar Jean Charles, you've got Marquez Valdez Scantling, you've got Josh Jones, the right guard or swing tackle, you've got River Craycraft, Demarcus Lawrence, DeAnthony Bell, Eric Saubert. What grade do you give the Seahawks?
I want to say incomplete because the draft has not happened yet. But right now, I'm going to say B minus two. The hard thing I have with evaluating this whole thing is this wasn't their plan. Like a lot of
Right.
this was just adjusting to what, like they got punched in the mouth in a couple areas and they had to adjust on the fly. I think the way they've adjusted is pretty good. But overall, they didn't address their interior offensive line, and I didn't think that. I thought the free agent class was a lot weaker than what me and you initially thought based on their scheme. And there's not a lot of areas I think they improved, but I like how they adjusted to the Geno thing. I like the DK trade, and I like the Demarcus Lawrence addition. I think he's got potential, but I'd say a B minus right now.
Yeah, I think I'm at like. By the way, I didn't mention obviously re-signing Ernest Jones and Jaron Reed, Josh
Yeah, that should
Jobe.
be factored in more. I think Ernest Jones is one of the five best deals handed out in all of
I think
fantasy.
every contract they've signed, for my money, have been really good contracts. So I think I'm pretty much fine with all their contracts. I'd say this. I think I'm around a C for the Seahawks so far. I don't think that they've clearly gotten better in a lot of the places where they've moved guys around. I think the guys that they have brought in are all smart, wise decisions. I think they could turn out to be good. I think they could turn out to be bad. Um, I don't see like a clear like okay they are way better than they were because of these moves. So I can't really go above a C, but I think to your point, I think they've navigated been a challenging offseason pretty well. And I don't think they've done anything that is debilitating where they're screwed because they did X, Y, or Z. That's where you start getting into really bad territory. And I don't think they clearly got worse. I think they may have, but I don't think it's clear that they've gotten worse.
Well, that's why it's like it's an incomplete picture because I say this all the time. Free agency does not is not an area where you typically get a lot better in certain spots. You can add a player here and there, but like we all said, like this is one of the worst free agent classes we've ever seen.
Mm-hmm.
The draft, and they added two draft picks to kind of put this picture together. So until we see, do they add another receiver? Do they add interior offensive line? The whole picture doesn't really complete to me. If they go out and blow the draft, then that really tells a story of there's a potential they got worse in multiple spots and got older and didn't do anything to help their team. But the draft is what elevates teams, not free agency. So I didn't see a lot of areas really where they could have like Will Fries would have been one, but their potential and well, I'm not sure if I'm giving them the benefit of the doubt anymore, but other than Will Fries, they didn't see much anywhere
Yeah.
else.
Yeah.
I think the big misses were Joe Thuney, Drew Dahlman. I think but Dahlman seemed like he wanted to go to the Bears, but Tevin Jenkins, I don't think changes their
No,
outlook. I don't think.
James Daniels is on that list of missed opportunities to me
Yeah,
as
like that
well.
felt like a good bet. Like that would have been a good bet. I don't think they made enough of like the good upside, but like I need to see the draft to make this whole thing work.
Yeah,
And if they had like Minnesota has no draft picks, so they had to do what they did. If Seattle has a good draft, I think they're going to end up a better team than last year,
I agree.
and
All
that
right.
makes it a good offseason to me. So
Normally, you and I would do a mock draft. I do not have time for it today, unfortunately. So maybe we'll do it again sometime this week. But I teased it, so I want to at least share it. You talk about the draft. this is not going to be a shocker, but I'm going to tell you, like, I've finalized my pick for the Seahawks. It is Gray Zabel at 18 if he is there. And the reason Gray Zabel is the pick for me is I think his ability to play center and to be the center that they add is huge. I think he could end up being their, Graham Barton, their Creed Humphrey, their like centerpiece guy, literally, for an offense that depends on quality center play. And it allows them to wait until 50 or 52 or maybe even later to get a guard. Like they could end up with Gray Zabel and Tate Ratledge. They could end up with Gray Zabel and Jonah Savai Naya. They could end up with a lot of different combinations and let the guard option go later. I've been thinking about Gray Zabel as a guard primarily because I think that's maybe like where I'd love him to be. But I think the fact that he could come in and be center unlocks so many options for the Seahawks with their later picks. So to me, that's the pick. I'm pretty locked into it. Curious your thoughts.
We did the show last week. You asked me who I wanted 18. He was the first one on my list. So I think one of us in the chat was like, Zabel at 18 feels early a couple weeks ago. And it kind of did. But the more I've kind of studied the other options and who we're looking at and what they need, Daniel Jeremiah had him going 16. I don't think 18 is too early anymore. I think that's as comfortable as a hand and glove fit. I think he can fit in at center. I think he can fit at left guard. But I see what you're saying now. It just opens up the flexibility of the draft where you could then take Jared Wilson later, or you could take Ratledge later. Mm-hmm. And it kind of hits you in both areas.
Exactly.
And so I thought you were going to say Donovan Jackson because like he just feels so clean as well at left guard. But Zabel's to me the guy is just. I think if they were running the gap scheme or they were running a different offense, this would be not the right fit. But in their scheme and what they want to do and what they need, the range, the player, the upside, it fits so cleanly. I had him number one on my list last week, and I said I had to kind of take time to get there. I'm there. I think that's the pick I'd be happiest with at this point.
Yeah. You hit it exactly on the head. Gives them flexibility of what to do. Obviously, I love Zabel and Jackson. You get both of them somehow, that's an A+ for me. But to your point, if you get Zabel and Jared Wilson and Wilson becomes your center and Zabel's your guard, that's great. If it's Zabel and Ratledge, and Zabel's at center and Ratledge is a guard, that's great. I think there's a lot of combinations that I would like, but I think Zabel is a key to unlocking all the options that they have in the draft. So, Jeff, apologies we didn't get more time to talk draft. We will definitely do that later.
We got a month.
We will have plenty of time to do it. Make sure you give Jeff Simmons a follow. Jeff, thanks for coming on, and have a great rest of your Saturday. Folks, I will be heading out tomorrow morning to the NFL annual meeting. So I'm leaving early in the morning. I get in late at night in Florida. Don't know if I'm going to have an opportunity to do a show. If I do, I will. If I don't, I won't. So keep an eye out. The best way to know, give the show a like, click subscribe, and then click that little bell to get notified when I go live. That way you know when it's going to happen. All right, one super chat here. Hawks fan Mattman says, it feels like odd makers are giving the 49ers the benefit of considering their draft capital that they're just ignoring with Seattle. I think that might be it, Matt. My read of it is they actually are just giving the 49ers the benefit of history and buzz of like the blue chip players that they got, and taking advantage of the fact that people just still think that team's good, even though they were absolute ass last year. All right, everybody, thank you for tuning in. I got to head out. I'm Brian Emhauser, and this has been another episode of Hawk Blogger Mornings. Take care.